Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Today's video will be focused on teaching you how to use the terrain tools in Unity. This is a tutorial for beginners. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this content, since it really helps the channel grow. Thank you very much, and let's begin. So first thing you want to do is right click in the hierarchy, 3D object, and create a terrain. Now click on the terrain that you just created, and you can see that there are a lot of different features and tools that can be used. So we're gonna start with the very first one, which is called Create Neighbor Terrains. As the name says, this is basically to just create terrains that are automatically attached to the one that you already have in the scene. As you can see, there are some lines which define the boundaries of the next terrain. All you have to do to create one is just click one of these squares. For example, I'm just going to press this one here. As you can see, after some loading, he created a new one, and you'll see new boundaries, new squares appear next to it, which you can press again to create new terrains, and you can repeat this process over and over again. What is very interesting about this tool is that, for example, if we are going to raise a terrain like here, the next terrain that you create on this side will be automatically connected and mirrored like this. That means that you won't have to raise it yourself, it will just be automatically done. This is a very handy tool to use if you want to expand your map as you make it and you don't know the initial size from the start. Let's delete all of this and let's move on to the category of pane terrain. The first is raise or lower terrain. As the name suggests, this feature is used to increase or decrease the height of the terrain. Now, before we actually start raising or lower the terrain, we're going to apply a texture to it so that it's easier to see what we're doing. For that, we want to use the next feature, which is pane texture. So let's click on that. Here you can click on edit terrain layers and then add a layer. This will allow you to add a layer to the existing terrain, and you can choose the texture that you want apply on top. So for this we're going to choose grass. As you can see, he has applied the texture to the whole terrain. This is basically the default texture that it's using. I will explain later on how to paint and adjust, but for now let's go back to raise or lower terrain. Now that we have an actual texture applied, we can see a little bit better, so select any brush you want and increase the opacity to the max. You will see that when the opacity is very high, a simple click will raise the terrain quite a lot. This is basically a pretty big hill considering the size of the terrain. However, if you decrease the opacity to something quite low, maybe around 10, you will see that by only clicking once, the terrain is raised a lot less, and you have to actually hold it to increase the height a lot. So basically this is just the intensity of the brush, how easy it is to raise and how easy it is to lower. Now you can choose any type of brush, some are better than others in my opinion, depending on what you need to do. For example, if you want to create a terrain that has a river in the middle, then this brush is perfect. You can just increase the size so that it covers all of the terrain, and then just put the opacity quite high and raise the terrain quite a bit. As you can see, this has basically raised the terrain everywhere aside from the middle, which would be perfect to place a river. Now let's move on to the next feature, paint holes. Now what this feature does is pretty straightforward. It simply masks some of the terrain height map in order to create holes in the terrain. So for example, if I decrease the brush size and put the opacity quite high, and then I click on the terrain, you can see that it has created a hole in the terrain that is the exact shape of my brush. Now depending on the opacity, you can control how these pixels are raised a little bit better, but this is a pretty straightforward tool. It's very interesting if you want to create pieces of land with maybe some edges or cliffs. It's really useful. Right, let's move on to the next one, which is paint texture. I've already showed you guys how to add a layer. You simply click on edit terrain layers and then add. Let's say that we want to add also dirt. it won't be automatically placed on the terrain since we already have a base layer. Alright, now that the texture has been added, let's select any brush and let's just paint a little bit. As we mentioned before, depending on the brush that you have selected and the intensity, you can do different things on the terrain. Let's have a look at the details for each texture. So, this is the texture that's been used, this is the normal map, this is the normal scale. As you can see, this sort of gives depth to the texture, so the higher it is, the more realistic and 3D it looks like, while if it's quite low, it will look more flat. Depending on how realistic your terrain is, you might want to increase a little bit. You have the metallic and the smoothness. And finally, you have the size of the tiling. So currently it's 4x4. If you put it, for example, to 1x1, you can see that it decreases in size. And if you put it to 10x10, you can see that it increases in size. I think for the size of the terrain, 4x4, it's fine. You can repeat this process as many times as you want, so you just go on to add layer and add another one with whichever texture you want. Make sure to select it and then start painting. Let's say that you've painted some of the terrain with a texture and now you want to replace it with one that you think looks better. You just click on the texture that you want to replace, click on edit terrain, replace layer, and then just click on another one. And what this will do is simply replace the texture in the points that you've painted so that you don't have to repeat the process from scratch. Next feature we're going to have a look at is set height. Now this feature is quite similar to the first one, to raise or lower terrain. However, it allows you to control the height of the terrain in a more precise way. So let's say that this part here that I've painted with the dirt, I want it to be a specific height. What I can do is select a brush, then click on the height, select whichever height I want it to be, for example 20, and then just paint. You can see that very part of the terrain that I'm painting on, even though I'm still clicking, it won't be going any higher or any lower. It's gonna stay exactly at 20, and this can be applied to any part of the terrain with any height. So if I put it, for example, to 30 and I hold, what it's going to do is just raise the terrain where I click exactly at 30 of height. This is quite useful if you want to control the height of a specific portion of the terrain and you don't want it to be higher or lower than what you need. If you click on flatten tile, what this will do is set the whole terrain to the height. So for example, I'll show you, I click on it, he has set all of the terrain to 30. However, we're going to undo this so we can keep the current shape. And if you click on flatten all, it will flatten all the terrains, assuming you have more than one in the scene. Let's proceed to the next one, which is called smooth height. What this does is basically smooth the height map of the terrain, so that if you don't want the edges, for example, of a cliff to look so stiff and sharp, you just select whichever brush you want, increase the opacity or decrease it depending on how smooth you want it. To show you, I'm gonna keep it at 100 and then just start clicking on the part of the terrain that you want to smooth. As you can see, it is very nice to smooth edges if you don't want them to be very sharp and very visible. This will help give the terrain a more smooth and less sharp appearance. Let's move on to the next one, which is stamp terrain. Now, if this stamp terrain is not visible, it's because you haven't imported the asset pack that I've listed in the description down below. This is a very useful tool and it's completely free to download from the Unity Asset Store, so I would highly suggest to download it if you're going to be practicing with terrains and creating environments. What this does is simply stamp whichever brush you have selected onto the terrain height map. Let me give you an example. Let's choose this star brush since it's quite obvious. Let's increase the opacity quite high and decrease the brush size a little. Let's also set the stamp height quite high, maybe to 20. You can see the silhouette. If I increase it, you will see how high the terrain will go. So let's keep it to 20 and just click once. As you can see, it stamped the shape onto the terrain. This is really useful. For example, if you didn't want to spend too much time creating mountains for your level, you would just select a brush like this, Highlands, increase the brush size quite a bit and reduce the opacity, adjust the stamp height to wherever you see fit, and just click on the terrain once. As you can see, this created a pretty nice looking mountain without you having to spend too much time on the tool and on the terrain painting and adjusting. If you see, the edges are quite sharp, so as I showed you before, you would go on smooth height and simply increase the opacity, decrease the size, and just adjust the edges however you saw fit. So that's it for the Stamp Terrain tool. As I said, it's a very useful tool which I highly suggest using if you're going to spend quite a bit of time on a terrain. Let's now move on to the next section of the terrain, which is paint trees. As the name suggests, this feature is used to paint trees, foliage, plants onto the terrain, and there are two ways you can do this. You can either do it manually and paint them yourself, or you can mass place them. But first, before doing any of those, we need to add them to the terrain. To do that, just click on Edit Trees, Add Tree. This window will open up, and just type the name of the tree that you want to add. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be adding one of the ones that I've already imported. You might have different ones, that's completely up to you. Let's click, for example, on the Fir 03 Medium and add it by pressing this button right here. Once it's added, we can start placing it into the terrain. You have the brush size here, which increases depending on the number. The tree density determines how many trees will be placed within the brush size. The tree height determines the height of the tree that you want to place. You can either have one value by selecting this in the same spot, or select two values and then tick random to spawn trees that will be a height between this value here and this value here, which usually helps in making the terrain and environment feel a little bit more diverse. So I'm going to select two values that are pretty distant from each other and just tap once. As you can see, the trees that have been spawned are different heights, which helps in giving the terrain and environment some diversity. You can also do the same for the tree rotation and for the color variation. That's completely up to you what you want to spawn. Now, we can either place trees manually by adding them and then clicking on the terrain ourselves, or what we can do is also mass place them by clicking this button right here, which will open this window. Here we have the number of trees that we want to spawn, and here we have a box that will determine whether we spawn this amount and keep the current one, or if we untick it, spawn this amount and erase the current ones. For the purpose of this video, we're going to erase them and add 4,000 trees to the terrain. Just click on place, and it will spread them across the whole terrain somewhat randomly, covering the whole surface with the amount that you have selected. This tool is pretty handy if you want to cover a large terrain with trees or foliage or plants or grass and you don't want to place them manually all yourself. Assuming that you add more than one tree, so let's for example add another one, we're going to add this one here, and you click on mass place trees. Let's repeat the process by deleting the current ones. What it will do is place a mixture of all the trees that you have here in the selection. So as you can see, some are the tall ones and some are the short ones. Basically, it chose randomly between these two and placed 4,000 all over the terrain surface. So if you want to, for example, place trees, plants, foliage, grass, just select wherever you want and then click on mass place trees. Of course, if you want to polish a specific area of the terrain, you can also delete them or add them manually to adjust the scene to wherever your vision is. In order to add trees, as shown, we just click on the terrain. However, if we want to erase trees, there are two things we can do. So if you hold Shift and then click, it will erase all the trees in the selected area. However, if you hold Ctrl and then click, it's going to erase from the area only the trees that you have selected here. So for example, I'm holding Ctrl and I just want to delete this specific model. I'm going to select it and just go around the map erasing that specific model. Same thing for this one. If I want to erase these small ones from this area right here, I'm just going to hold Ctrl, and go through the map, deleting that specific model. Let's now move on to the next tool. Alright guys, the last tool that we want to look at is the Paint Details tool. For this I've created a new terrain since it would be easier to see. Just click on the Paint Details, same thing we did for the tree. Just click on Edit Details, add Grass Texture, select on whichever texture for the grass that you want to add. I'm going to add this one right here. Let's just add it and let me show you what each of those things does. As you can see, just click on it and it will spawn some grass on the terrain. If you click on Edit Details and then Edit, minimum width is just the minimum amount of the width that the grass can have. So for example, if you put this to 0.2 and the max width to 1, the grass that will be spawned will be between these two values. So the minimum it can be is 0.2 and the maximum it can be is 1. Let's keep it to 1 and 2. Same thing for the height. If we put this, for example, to 2 and 5, the grass that will be spawned will be between these two values. So let's keep it between 1 and 2. You don't really want to touch the noisy and noise spread. And finally, you have the healthy color and the dry color. So as you can see, the color changes depending on what I'm selecting. Let's go with something quite bright green. And for the dry color, we'll go with something a little bit more reddish. You can see that the grass has some shades of colors now, and it's not all green or all red. And finally, billboard basically makes it so that all the grass textures are facing the camera if it's ticked, while if it's not ticked, they will just face a random direction. Now, if the texture seems to be pulled, that is because of some of the settings in the terrain settings. So let's click on it, scroll all the way down to wind settings for grass, and let's just click this and put this to 0.1, 0.1 and 0.1. As you can see now, it's not being pulled anymore, as if there's wind, it's just pretty much straight and up. You can then select the brush as usual, just to increase the brush size, the opacity and the target strength to place as many as you want. You can repeat this process, add some more grass textures, and then just increase the height a little bit to make them feel a little bit more diverse, like this. Change the color a little. That will give the field a bit more of a realistic look, as you can see. Alright guys, and with that we're done for this tutorial. I hope this was clear. If you want a more in-depth tutorial about each of the tools and features, then let me know in the comments down below. Also, there are more things that you can do with the terrain in Unity, especially if you have some plugins and external asset packs that you can import. However, those are more complicated and require a little bit of practice to use. So let me know if you would like to see something like that. Thank you very much for staying until the end, guys. Hope you have a nice day, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.